James stood stunned, his hands hovering just over Nia's shoulders, as he was clearly unsure about how or even whether he should comfort her. The situation he, or really all of them, had been put into was anything but fair. He obviously wasn't going to try and wave his sister off with a cheap downplay of it all, nor was he ever going to lie to her. Of course, he wasn't remotely planning to go anywhere just to die, but the threat they found themselves under now put him between a rock and a hard place. Before James could fully collect his thoughts to even try to discuss all this with his distraught sister, Sheeta had made her way over to the two of them. Gently, she laid her hand down onto Nia's shoulder, giving it a light squeeze. James looked at her with some surprise. It took a moment, but eventually Nia also managed to drag her face away from James's chest to look up at Sheeta. "We're not going to let that happen," Sheeta said firmly. Her tone was empathetic and reassuring. However, while her one hand just gently held onto Nia's shoulder, the other one was balled into a tight fist. She shifted her gaze from the crying woman up to her boyfriend, her partner. So endlessly much had happened ever since this journey, this ordeal began. But when they made eye contact at that moment, although they both felt the worry and the empathy for Nia's distress, each of their gazes burned with the same determined certainty. In this endless stack of hay, this was the last straw. Seemingly emboldened by Sheeta's gaze, James finally allowed his hands to sink as well. As they laid on Nia's shoulders, his organic hand was placed right on top of Sheeta's as well. "Nobody's going anywhere to die," he assured Nia. His eyes glimmered with a wet sheen, and his jaw quivered slightly. He was still weak, and he also wasn't over Nia's passionate plea. Clearly, he had to fight heavily against even the thought of not immediately caving to such a demonstration of her care. Nia, however, heavily shook her head. "Then let's just go," she pleaded once more, her hands not letting go of her brother as she stared up at him with wide eyes. "There's nothing you can still do here." "She's right, kid," Finn chimed in from the side, his gaze empathetic, but also clearly trying to make his nephew see reason. "You know this by now. Sometimes you gotta know when to call it. Pull back a bit and regroup. Get better footing, and then push back when you have an actual opening." Looking at James's face, Sheeta could see it. Something was going through his mind. It was as if he heard something echoing far away. His face nearly dissociated for a moment, before he suddenly clenched his teeth. "We came here because we wanted to stop reacting," he said, before letting out a long exhale. He looked into their eyes, first Finn, then Nia. "I get what you're saying, and if I could just go, I would," he said, before averting his gaze for a moment. "But they won't allow that," he then explained further, a dark certainty in his voice. "I don't know how yet, but they won't simply let us leave. Not without a hefty price." Sheeta nodded slightly. Their opposition was brash and wasteful at times, sure, but even they wouldn't have put something of this magnitude on if it wasn't going to near certainly get them ahead in their mind. Those stuck in the station right now were part of that blackmail, sure, but there was almost certainly more still to come, and they would have to be ready for that. "You can't be sure," Nia still urged James, pulling him a little closer. In turn, James closed his eyes for a second, almost as if he meditated. Then he moved the hand that wasn't on Sheeta's down Nia's shoulder, sliding it along her arm, so he could gently hold onto it. "I promise, I am not going to just throw myself into danger," he assured her, opening his eyes to look directly into hers. "I won't go anywhere unless there is a very good reason for it." He then squeezed her arms a little tighter, his face turning ever so slightly more distraught as he, too, began to plead with her. "But please, you have to let me be ready in case I have to," he said, the firmness of his voice slowly faltering as he went on. "Don't tear me apart before it's even happened. I can't do what may need to be done if I know you'll hate me for it." Nia looked up at him, her own wet eyes almost desperately staring into his. Then, eventually, she allowed her head to drop again, pressing it right back into his chest. "This isn't fair," she sobbed into the fabric. James looked down at her for a moment, before shifting his gaze to look at Sheeta. She could only look back at him sadly. Nia was right. This wasn't fair. And although Nia remembered those days when James had disappeared, locked away from the world, She'd remembered more than that. She remembered standing in the bridge of Conglorch's ship, flying away, as James opened the dock for them. She remembered him, up on her screen, looking so relieved that he had got that door open, right before an explosion breached the room he was in. She remembered throwing herself at the terminal in desperation as she realized what might follow. Although she had been ready that he may not be able to follow them, had even tried to prepare Curie for that eventuality, the reality had only hit her harder when the time came. She remembered the pit in her stomach she had dragged with her for weeks after, the weights pressing down her shoulders. She remembered tearing her room and anything in it apart in some desperate thrash for any kind of control she could exert over anything. She wouldn't allow that to repeat itself. Never again. But still, she also couldn't put him into chains of her own. Whatever those monsters had prepared for him, there was no small chance that James would once again have to meet it head-on. There was likely no way to prevent that. But there was one thing she could influence this time. This time, she wouldn't let him stand alone. "Stand back, we're on your side," the human soldiers yelled at the approaching carnivores, all of whom had splattered their face in blood, much like they had all seen many in the galaxy do it during the recent protests. However, where it was usually quite easy to see that they used paint or other facsimiles to achieve the effect of blooded jaws, the stains on the faces of these individuals had a rather more convincing look about them. The leader of the charge, disturbingly a tenastrosite with a rather familiar coloration on his plates, even if this specimen was quite a bit more compactly built than the mighty frame of Conglorch, stuck his tongue out to lick along the bloody streaks on his face. His long tongue lapped up large patches of the dark, sticky substance on his lips, and his pupils visibly constricted as his taste hit his brain. "I do not believe those people are who they appear to be," Moore said, her own eyes widening as she realized these were not those same protesters they had seen on the news. The ongoing riot on the station had so far left them relatively unbothered, as neither the Raphaelite nor her Andalaya friend fell under the predator umbrella that those unjustly angry people held so much ire for, and their armed human security was apparently not deemed worth the risk of hassling them all on its own. Yet it seemed that lucky streak may have ended, as she saw those people approaching with their nigh-crazed eyes, narrowing in on her. Moore subconsciously moved her leg in front of Quiz to block those people's view on them. The human team lead clacked his lips. "Mammon's greed. Psychos crawling from the woodwork in the chaos?" he questioned more quietly to himself. His tone indicated that he wasn't exactly satisfied with that seemingly only explanation he could find. Moore felt a shiver run through her entire body as her eyes inadvertently met those of the tenastrosite as they wildly scanned the surroundings. In an instant, her mind went back to Gerwellitten, back to the burned and destroyed hallways, among the unfortunate corpses of the first victims of their opposition's horrid new weapon. There, among the dead she and Conglorch had fought. Weapon in hand in defense of herself and her friend, she had taken her first life. She remembered it. The dull feeling of the weapon's recoil, the sound of the shot, the gut-wrenching noise of the impact, and the light draining from the Coivory's eyes as they were slowly torn from this mortal plane. She remembered the shock of their death chilling her down to the bone. She remembered that brief feeling of having crossed a line she would never come back from. The feeling of the weight of a life that would now be forever shackled to her very being, forever tied so that she may never walk unburdened again. And then, she remembered her gaze moving to Conglorch, seeing the expression on his face, and how she suddenly realized that the weight she bore ultimately mattered so little, at least when she found herself faced with what she saw in it. The bloody jaws, dripping teeth, the endless stare that could see nothing but their victim. Just like she had been, he was a man forever changed. A man whose nature had formed a hunter, but whose life and soul had formed a person. A person then faced with the depths of the deeds necessary to protect him and others. An action that he, for its purpose, may not feel ashamed of, but that he would certainly never remember in anything but the most abhorrent light. And with that expression in her memory, Moore now looked at her friend's approaching conspecific. The bloody jaws, dripping teeth, and the glee with which she carried them. "I'm not saying it again," the human soldier warned once more, his weapon trained right on the enormous reptilian. One of the Tenaciousite's eyes flicked down to him as the lizard stopped in his tracks, seemingly reassessing the situation. Though he, and most likely all of the people behind him, were clearly insane, it seemed that he was still capable of rational thought, which only made his presence ever more disturbing. As his followers stopped behind him, the blooded Tenaciousite scanned over the humans, his gaze assessing their weapons with analytical sharpness. He was weighing his options. Moore could see it. He wasn't afraid of the weapons, not in the meaning of the word that mattered. He was analyzing his chances. Then, after a few seconds, he finally released a hissing huff before slowly turning on the spot and changing his direction. Without a word, he was about to walk off, signaling for his followers to do the same. Moore felt her arms start to shake as she watched him about to depart.
"Can we really just allow people like them to just walk freely?"
she questioned, unable to hold her tongue as her mind flashed with the contrast between those people and the one she dearly trusted. The team lead grunted and clutched his weapon in his hand. "We don't have the time to make an arrest right now," he said, his voice deep and almost growling, as if he had to press out the words against heavy resistance. "We need to go before those ships arrive, and the local security is proving less than useless." He gazed around for a moment, not just looking at those turning away right now, but also towards those filling the streets, who would likely take the presence of these individuals as a sort of twisted confirmation of the chaos they wrought. "There are a lot of people here who can't be allowed to just walk," he said, "but there's nothing we can do about it now. We have to get you and the council person to safety while we still can." Moore exhaled through her nose heavily. The threat approaching them was great, perhaps too great to face. Still, those people. Before she could finish her thought, Moore felt a tugging on the fur close to her ankle. Tilting her head, she looked down at Quiss. Her friend looked back up at her, all three of their eyes showing a determined gaze that dug right into her. It wasn't an expression she was used to seeing on them, but she instantly recognized it from the eyes of so many others she had been around recently. The gaze was as intense as it was apologetic. The gaze of a person who knew they were making an unfair request, a request that no one should ever have to grant. However, although Moore understood where they were coming from, knew that what they asked her was almost cruel in a way, the old Raphaelite did not hesitate. She nodded and raised her hand in a few quick signs, confirming that she thought exactly what they were thinking. With her confirmation obtained, Quiss moved fast. "Stop right there!" they called out, breaking out from behind Moore's leg and the protective bubble of their closest soldiers in a quick scuttle the guards obviously hadn't expected. Their seldom-used voice was croaky and uncomfortable as it yelled out the words in the galactic uniform language, but it still carried weight and authority as they gave the firm order. "You are not leaving!" The Tenaciousite and his followers snapped up, obviously surprised at being so suddenly addressed after they had already deemed the situation as disarmed in their mind. In the meantime, the human soldiers all stared down at their charge with suppressed terror as they realized what was happening. "Council person," the team lead whisper yelled in a hushed tone, clearly trying to urge Quiss to step back and not escalate things while they still had the chance to leave. The Tenaciousite stopped in his tracks, turning his head back to inspect the imperious Andalaya curiously. In total, he easily measured 10 times Quiss's size, if not far more, and yet the Andalaya was commanding him as if their voice was law. Quiss shook their body, their scales grinding against each other audibly as they took a firm stance. "I am Quiss, council member of the Galactic Council, elected by the galaxy's people," they declared, building themselves up like a rock against crashing waves. "I cannot and will not stand by and watch when faced with such barbarity." With his forelegs stepping almost in place, the Tenaciousite slowly turned more of his body, seemingly intrigued by Quiss's display. Intrigued and challenged, if his narrowing eyes were to be judged. The claws on Moore's feet scratched over the ground as she watched this unfold. However, although she felt her old heart beat heavily, she stood behind Quiss. "Quiss, please." The human team lead tried to urge one more time, his weapon directed towards the Tenashasite once again, while he attempted to convince his charge to drop the issue, at least for now. However, Quiss simply lifted their gaze towards the man and once again shook their body. "I thank you for your protection so far, Sergeant," they stated, their words turning more amenable now that they were addressing the human. "I understand that I cannot demand of you to face a threat like this for my sake. If you leave now, no one will hold it against you." They then turned their head to look at the Tenashasite once more. "But you are not my handler, and I am not your ward." They continued their statement, shifting their legs slightly to stand even firmer as they faced down the impossible adversary. "And I have decided that I can't stand by and watch." The sergeant's eye visibly widened. Briefly, he turned to look back at Moore, clearly hoping for a moment that she would be able to talk sense into her friend. However, his hopes were disappointed, as he saw that she stood firmly with Quiss, not against them. It may be a hopeless battle, but they could not hide from it. The human grit his teeth as his face snapped back and forth between Quiss and the blooded giant, clearly unsure of how to handle this situation. Obviously, he wasn't ready to simply leave the council member behind, but he also had his orders and a responsibility to his team. Meanwhile, Moore could see the Tenashasite once again contemplate. He looked down at Quiss, and the challenge the Andalaya brought against him still burned in those orange eyes. He definitely wanted to take it. But then his gaze moved to the uncertain sergeant, who was torn between staying and going. He looked at the human's face and then down at the weapon in his hand. Then, after a moment, it seemed like his earlier judgment had not ultimately changed, despite Quiss's authoritative command. The man clearly didn't want to contest those weapons, and as long as that threat remained, he was not going to chance it. So he tore his gaze away, swallowing the obvious fire in his belly as he declined the challenge posed to him. "Stop!" Quiss demanded, and took a few steps to follow him. However, the Tenashasite simply ignored it. His idea was clear. He already knew that the humans were unwilling to arrest him, and Quiss and Moore alone, well, they could drag and tear how they wanted. There was almost no chance that those two would have the necessary force to stop him and his followers. He would simply walk, and if Quiss wanted to throw themselves under his feet to try and stop him, he would likely be just fine with that. Moore's teeth clenched at the outcome. She too was tempted to go after them and forcefully drag them back, but her gaze moved to the soldiers. They had been allowed to leave, yes. They were under no further obligation to protect either her or Quiss if they went against their security's judgment to pursue those people further. However, she knew that they would. They would stay. They would fight for them, even if they did not want to. Even if they felt like it was detrimental to them, they would. These were humans who took it as their duty to do so, even if it wasn't. She could see it. She had agreed with Quiss willingly, but would it be fair to these soldiers to pull them deeper, even while they expressed it was not what they wished? Then again, the way they were clutching the weapons, the eyes with which they stared at those blood-smeared Moors, they too were torn between duty and conviction. Suddenly, a deafening bang ripped through the station, followed by an ear-piercing snap. Moore felt her heart skip a few beats from the shock as her head rang with the noise, unsure where the obvious shot had come from and whether it was friend or foe. However, who seemed even more rattled than her was the Tenashasite, who had frozen in place after the shock of the shot, not even daring to set his lifted foot down as his eyes widened and his jaws clenched. Though she obviously hadn't seen anything, Moore could only assume that the reptilian had more than just heard the shot, as he was seemingly affected by it more than anyone else. Perhaps he had felt a draft of air. Perhaps it was more. Clear was, he had been at its center, somehow. "You heard the council member!" A new voice now joined the ongoing situation. It was high and clear, and spoke with a more calm and concise, but no less heavy authority than Quiss's. "You are under arrest!" A long blonde head of hair, was the first thing Moore saw as she turned her head in search of the new marksman who had come to their aid. Sam, as she knew her, or Captain Anderson as the soldiers would address her, held a large rifle, the length of which rivaled herself in height, directed at the apparent group of blood-smeared sapiophages. Her icy blue eyes were cold as ever as they fixated on each of their faces for a moment, her finger caressing the guard of her trigger after it had gotten to fire the earlier warning shot. "Captain!" the team-leading sergeant exclaimed, as he too realized who had joined the fray there. There was a hint of relief in his voice, now that someone with vastly more authority than himself had entered the picture and made a very clear decision about the situation. Sam removed her gaze from the arrested, briefly to glance over her fellow soldiers. "Any of you who want to retreat to the ship are free to do so," she announced. "Catch up to the Admiral and join her group. You'll be out of here in no time." It was clear she thought the same thing as Moore had. These people shouldn't be forced to stay against their will, not with the threat looming on the horizon. "But Captain," the sergeant was about to protest, but Sam shut him down quickly. "Don't worry about me," she firmly ordered. "I know what I'm doing and take full responsibility." While she was seemingly distracted, one of those following the Tenaciousite attempted to make a break for it. Since they had started following them, Quiz had made it quite close to those forming the group's anchor. Now that their guards seemingly weren't looking, a smaller specimen of the leader's species snapped around. In a flash, they lunged forwards in a brief gallop, while reaching out one of their front maulers in an attempt to grab at the still much smaller council member. Moore's blood froze at the sight. However, the attempt was as short-lived as its perpetrator, when Sam showed that she wasn't slacking nearly as much as the Tenaciocyte seemed to think. Another bang, another whip. Once again, Moore found herself reminded of Geralitton as she witnessed the cold precision with which the human officer eliminated the threat, sending his enormous body collapsing to the ground as the bullet pierced him. However, "Chris!" Moore yelled out, and ran towards her friend as the Tenaciocyte's momentum didn't stop with his death. Inertia carried his mass forward, even as it toppled to the ground. Falling over itself, the body began to tumble and slide, careening towards the Andalaya it had previously tried to grab. Quiz jolted and tried to move away, but it was too late to avoid it completely. Soon, their small shape disappeared beneath masses of their attacker, swallowed by a heap of limbs and armored plates. Dread filled Moore's body as she ran towards the pile, with two of the humans joining her in her charge as she closed in. Still, it was ultimately her who grabbed onto the body, not caring one bit for the life that had once inhabited it, or the blood she smeared her fur with, as her claws hooked into the lizard's armor and pulled with all her might to get the dead heap off her friend. Very likely, the giant's mass was more than she had lifted, or even moved in many, many years. However, she hardly felt it, as she braced her feet against the station's floor and just pulled. Whether she thought she could do it or not, the mass moved. First, it was just its balance shifting, but soon enough, it actually began to slide and roll away from where she had last seen Quiz stand. With one last mighty yank, she basically tossed the body aside, sending it to roll for a moment before it was left laying flat on its face. From underneath it, Quiz came into view. The Andalaya lay curled on their side, their thick tail pulled between their legs, while their visible arm held onto it. Their eyes that could close were shut tight, while the third eye on their forehead stared dead ahead. As they laid there, half rolled into a ball, their body quaked. And while it hurt Moore's hammering heart to see them like that, it at least showed that they were still with her. The old lady was winded and heavily gasped for breath as she looked down at her friend. She was about to kneel down to try and check on them further, however, in the motion, her eyes became stuck to the remainder of the aggressive group, some of which still stood rather close by. She saw them staring at her, and at Quist, seemingly still assessing the situation. Her already grinding teeth clenched even more as she released a loud, heavy huff through her nostrils. With instinct briefly driving her body more than reason, the old Raphaelite leaned her head down briefly before thrusting it upwards in the carnivore's direction, bearing the tips of her long horns towards them in a protective display. She repeated the motion a few more times at various angles, throwing her horns towards anyone who dared leer for a moment too long, before she finally lifted her head up again. Her eyes were narrowed in a dark glare as she sought the eyes of the aggressors, daring any of them to try and step closer. Did she stand a very good chance in case any of them took her up on that? Who knew? But she was going to let them find out that much. Her horns and claws were ready. For what may have been the first time in her life, her weapons were justifiably bared for exactly what nature had intended them for. In the meantime, the humans were carefully helping Quiss up from their cold position. The Andalaya was still quaking as they began to stand, and the shoulder they had previously laid on looked anything but healthy as they clutched it in pain. The best case was that it was simply dislocated. However, more feared that it may be worse. "If you can walk, get away from them," Sam yelled out, slowly approaching the group, though clearly keeping enough distance to make use of her advantage in range. Then she shifted her attention back onto the attackers. "And you all are under arrest! Do not try to resist!" After a moment of internal struggle, Moore managed to convince her instincts that the human's large gun was a better deterrent than her horns. However, she still dutifully guided the rest of her herd as they slowly moved away from the hostiles. Only once they were all out of Claw's reach did she look back down at Quiss, who was still clutching their shoulder as if they were afraid it was about to fall off.
"Are you alright?"
she asked, doing her best to keep any of her previous anger out of her caring voice. Quiss briefly attempted to lift their clutching hand, likely trying to sign in reply. However, as soon as they had let go of their shoulder, they flinched heavily and went right back to holding it. "Being better," they stated verbally instead, even if they sounded slightly chagrined about it. Likely, their throat was already hurting from the GU they had loudly spoken earlier. "But it's worth it, if someone else will be spared a much worse fate for it." Moore nodded, and then took one last glance, at least for the moment, at the blood-smeared people. So far she had suppressed it, but now she couldn't help but wonder where the blood had actually come from. The blood and...
"What are they doing here now all of a sudden?" she questioned, hoping that she was quiet enough to only be heard by those around her.
Quiss released a hurt croak before mustering the energy to answer. "Abusing the chaos," they stated certainly. But then their tail hammered against the station floor a single time, almost as if they had energy they simply needed to let out. "The question is, how did they know such chaos was about to unfold?" "We cannot let those people roam free. They are a danger to anyone around them," Captain Anderson explained over the comm line, while Admiral Krieger listened carefully. "Much more efficiently so than the rioters." The Admiral grimaced a bit, but kept her tone neutral as she opened her own line and replied, "If you attempt to make the arrest now, you may not make it back to the ship in time." She could have simply ordered the officer to grab the VIP and get her ass back to the ship. However... "Then that's a risk I am going to have to take, ma'am," the captain replied, with determination in her voice. "The VIP also decided to stay, and I cannot leave them unguarded." Admiral Krieger nodded to herself. "Look out for yourself, Captain," she then ordered in turn, giving her blessing for the captain to act as she deemed best. She knew she could trust Captain Anderson to conduct herself in a way worthy of that position. "I will, thank you, ma'am," Captain Anderson replied, before the communication ended. "Anderson out." Although she had given her blessing, the Admiral's grimace darkened a bit as she allowed her eyes to glide around the streets of the station that surrounded her. The ball of soldiers she was walking with, as well as the loudly buzzing psychopomps flying overhead, were doing a good job of clearing out large chunks of the ongoing riots, allowing her and her people to traverse the area more or less unbothered. However, she also knew that was far from the norm right now, especially for people branded with the same markers as she was. Carnivore, Deathworlder, Cyborg. Without the enormous firepower she had at her back, they all were in more than just danger in this current climate that seemed to have erupted out of nothing. The security of a whole station's worth of people, as well as her very own captivity, all for what seemed to be a mere distraction. Was it meant to cover for the incoming invasion, or was there something else? Either way, she had to admit that she respected the council members' determination to stand and face this chaos. Of course, her inner voice quietly asked the small off-worlder who exactly they thought they were, trying to face down such impossible odds and likely perishing in the process if they didn't have the right support. However, in all honesty, they seemed to know exactly who they were. A council member, someone who had been elected by the people, elected to lead, and apparently tried to lead they would, even if they may have been better suited to delegate from far away. Though they were kept at a distance, her eyes looked to those rioting, those who had threatened her very own people, who wished to do nothing but free her from her unknown imprisonment.
Ma'am, what's your status?
Celestine's voice came through the comm line now. Although he obviously had a rather good overview of the situation through various video feeds, he usually took her word into account wherever he could. "We're inbound to the dock," the Admiral replied dutifully. But then she couldn't help but let out a sigh. "But it is chaos down here. Who knows what might happen once we leave it to itself?"
"I'm afraid we don't have a choice, ma'am,"
Celestine soon replied. And Krieger couldn't argue. Right. What chance did they have?